The convergence of our voices is the song of our beauty. Many voices will speak here, the song woven through diverse notes. Hello, everyone. And I'd like to introduce you this morning to Ceallaigh MacCath Moran, who has a doctorate in folklore from Memorial University in Newfoundland, and she is speaking today from Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. So I would like to ask you, Ceallaigh, about getting a doctorate in folklore. What did you have to do?
Well, we began, all of us, my master's degree and my PhD cohort, all began in field school. So it was sort of an in the deep end beginning. We all got into cars and trucks and buses, and we went out to Cupid's, Newfoundland, and we stayed there for 6 weeks. And we all bunked together, and we learned how to conduct ethnographic interviews. We learned how to use audio and video equipment. We learned how to conduct interviews in a sensitive way. So if we were dealing with a sensitive topic, we understood how we learned how to deal with that sensitively. And after 6 weeks, if we survived, and we all did, we went back, and I had 2 years of coursework specifically in folkloristics. So I took courses on the legend, I took courses in oral history, I took courses in folk belief, I took courses in folk performance. And folk performance is super interesting because it is theater and folk music and so forth, but performativity is, there was a big shift in folkloristics in the 1970s, where we began to see folklore as imminent. It isn't necessarily quaint beliefs or books about the past. It's happening right now in everyday life, in every performance. And so a folklorist is taught to look at every event, every performance as unique, as a new expression of folklore, and to evaluate the performer and the audience, which may actually be theatrical or musical, or it may be performer and audience in a situation like 150 pieces of literature, all in folkloristics. I read 50 pieces in folk belief, 50 pieces in folk narrative, and 50 pieces in performance. And then I put together a proposal for my research and dissertation. And I went out into the field. I went to Toronto. My interest was in ethical belief and performativity in the animal rights movement, which is absolutely folklore because, again, folklore is imminent. We make it all the time. And I went out into the field in Toronto and was in Toronto for 6 weeks when the pandemic was declared.
Oh.
And so my research was cut short and I came home. But fortunately, I had done some research and interviewing and ethnographic field work while I was in coursework. And it was on the same topic or very close to the same topic. So I received the department's approval to bring all of that material, all that ethnographic material together under the same roof. And I did that, and I pulled together a dissertation from that. And I wrote my dissertation in late 2022 and early 2023. I finished early this year. And then, of course, I had to pass an oral defense. And I did that on June 9th? June 8th or 9th. It was early June. So that's what getting a folklore PhD is all about. There are 3 institutions in North America that will award you a folklore PhD. One is Memorial University of Newfoundland, where I went to school. One is Indiana University, and one is Laval in Quebec, and it's taught in French. So it's not a fairly common PhD, but where it is supported in those 3 institutions, it's very robust.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you get your PhD and go out into the world, how do you use it?
Well, it's used in a number of different ways. I mean, folklorists may become public folklorists, so they go out into the public sector and they work in heritage and they work in museums Folklorists might go out and work in a musical capacity. They're ethnomusicologists who specifically study musical folklore, and they work in music. Uh, for myself, I've been offered the opportunity to teach at Cape Breton University, and it's not for me right now. I had been offered coursework and had been offered coursework for the 2 or 3 years. And because I am a crone, and because I'm finishing my degree in the middle of my life, I have the freedom and the opportunity to create. And so I'm bringing my love of folkloristics to bear on my creative life. I have lots of creative projects ready to work on. Some of them I've already started. And I also, since, gosh, this started in 2017. Well, no, it started in 2016, right after I started university. I began to realize how much folkloristics had to say to storytellers.
Oh, yes.
Um, and so I started keeping notes and putting together ideas, and I talked to other writers and I talked to other publishing professionals who were very keen to have me um, keep a dispatch for storytellers and writers and musicians about principles of folkloristics. So I started that in 2019 while I was still a student, and it was called Folklore and Fiction. And that went on for 2 years monthly. And I covered topics like myth and legend and fairy tale and child lore and language and verbal lore and performance and so forth. And I looked at the Arne Thompson Uther Index and tale types, and I looked at motifs. And, I really just tried to bring the principles of folkloristics to the storytelling craft.
Hmm.
And then I had folks who were encouraging me to write a book. So that book is presently in progress. It's titled The Storyteller's Guide to Folklore. And when it's finished, it will be a handbook for storytellers of all kinds about the principles of folkloristics and how to use it in storytelling, how to use them in storytelling.
Hmm. Well, that sounds great. I think I'd like to have that book when it's finally published. And you've also been doing some music, haven't you?
I have. And music, you know, I've been a musician all my life. But I've had various, it's been one of those things that I was blocked. It was blocked with me for a long time. And there were lots of reasons for that. Sometimes we do get blocked creatively. I wasn't blocked as a writer, but as a musician, I really was. And in during the pandemic, especially in the early days of the pandemic, when we came home, I had a dear friend who is herself a crone, who is a professional musician and has been for 35 or 40 years. She still fronts a goth band in her 60s. And I swear I want to be this woman when I grow up. Um, and we had been meeting on a weekly basis because I wanted to get my voice back in shape. And she became sort of a mentor and a friend to my music. And because of her support, I continued to practice and strengthened and overcame my block. And I put out an EP titled Shatter and Rise in 2022. And it was just 3 songs. I played all of the instruments on the songs, the bodhrán, the guitar, the shruti box. I wrote all of the songs. And now, oh, yes. And for folklore and fiction, anytime there was a traditional ballad that needed to be sung for the podcast, because that dispatch did become a podcast after 2 years, I would perform it. So I
Hmm.
have 5 traditional ballads, traditional child ballads that were performed for the sake of the podcast, for the Folklore and Fiction podcast, and I'm re-releasing those at the end of this year. So I'm working on them now. I'm re-recording them. I'm kind of taking a look at what I want to tinker about them. And then next year, I'll be putting together and releasing a new EP titled Lead On Wild God.
Ah, that sounds great too. Yeah, ballads are a really neat form of storytelling. And yeah, they're really interesting and fun.
I agree. And I've been working on, in fact, I was working on this last night. I was working on Matty Groves, the child ballad Matty Groves, which of course has been popularized by so many people, but my favorite version is Fairport Conventions.
Hmm.
Um, And I realized what had happened with the folklore and fiction dispatches and podcasts was that I put out 2 years of dispatches and then I started the podcast, right? And then
Yes.
I moved forward from there. Well, at one point, I thought, well, I should go back and podcast all these old dispatches so that people who listen have those as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in one of them, I had What is a Ballad, which was the title of that particular dispatch, and Matty Groves was discussed. And I thought, oh, well, I should just record it. But the only version I was familiar with, and I was in a hurry because I was ramping up to write my dissertation, so I just performed that one. But what's super interesting about Matty Groves, the Fairport Convention version of Matty Groves, is that they, of course, put that together themselves from Bertrand Harris Bronson's The Traditional Tunes of the Child Ballads. So it's not, and I have actually the book in front of me because I've been working with it. This is one of the
Wow.
one of the books in, I think it's a 5-volume set. This is volume 2. And this is the one I've been working with because this has Matty Groves in it. And it's all the tunes and all of the airs and all of the lyrics he was able to collect together. And of course, this was after Francis James Child did his work. So Bertrand Harris Bronson came in after him and tried to pull together all the tunes that Child left out because
Yes.
there are no tunes in Child's work. So anyway, back to your point about the ballad as an interesting form of storytelling. There are so many versions of the Child ballad, Matty Groves, and some of them are incomplete, and some of them tell different parts of the story than others, and some of them are sung in a major key. And I've always thought it was a little strange to sing a ballad about cuckolding and murder in a major key, but okay. um, so I've been looking at the story, which is itself, the ballad is a fairly long ballad. Um, and it has a very A-B structure. So the Fairport Convention version, the first verse is a holiday, and the first one of the year. Lord Donald's wife came into the church, the gospel for to hear. So, and when the meeting it was done, she cast her eyes about, and there she saw little Matty Groves walking in the crowd. So what you have there is an A-B structure, right? You
Mm-hmm.
have a question that's answered in the first half of the verse, both musically and lyrically, right?
Yes.
And it ends on that, I think it ends on the 5th there. And then, and the second half of each verse, you have the answer. You have the completion of the phrase, both musically and lyrically. But that repeats over and over and over and over and over again. And it can get boring,
Yeah.
right? And so
Mm-hmm.
while ballads are a super interesting form of storytelling, it's incumbent upon the storyteller, the singer of the ballad, to make that A-B structure that happens over the course of 6 to 10 minutes
Mm-hmm.
interesting enough to hold the attention of an audience.
Yes.
So that's what I've been working with in Matty Groves. I've been thinking, okay, how do I tighten the story? And what kind of air do I want to apply to this so that it's musically interesting for people to listen to for 10 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's going to be quite 10 minutes long, but you get the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. And so that will be recorded on
Yes,
your,
yes.
yes.
On the folklore and fiction ballads one, because I'm not going to go back and re-record the Fairport Convention version of Matty Groves because that belongs to them.
Yes.
And there's so much lovely ballad material to draw from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
let's do something new and interesting.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm doing.
Uh-huh. And so you don't do your podcast anymore? Is that right?
No,
No.
no, I concluded it at the end of, was 2023 the end of it? I think it was. It was never meant to be a long-term podcast. It was meant to complete a thought. So I had a certain agenda where it concerned the relationship between folkloristics and storytelling. And I wanted to explore that until I was done talking about it and then turn it into a book.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did that. I explored it until I was done talking about it. And then at the end of that time, I put the podcast on hiatus. I mean, people are still finding it.
Yes.
And right now, what's available publicly is an introduction to the longer episodes, and then the full podcasts are available on my website, actually. And you
Mhm.
don't have to pay for them or anything, but you do need to sign in. So you have to have an account. And you come into the website and you can use them as an archive. And that's what I always intended to do with this. I wanted for the because I was teaching myself while I was putting this material together, because I was learning too. Um, I wanted for other people to be able to benefit from what I was teaching myself while I was teaching them, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So all of the original podcast episodes and dispatches, which are the transcripts, are available behind an access wall at folkloreandfiction.com. And all you have to do is sign up for a free account, and then you can access all of them and listen to the podcasts on YouTube, and it's all there. So if you're working on a project, let's say you're working on a tall tale, and you're
Mm-hmm.
an oral storyteller who's going to get up on stage and tell a tall tale, but you want a little bit more nuance. How do tall tales work again, and how do we create that insider outsider dynamic in the audience? How do we do this? Then you can log in and go to my episode on tall tales and read the transcript and kind of get your head around it a little better. That's what that's there for.
Yeah, so the craft of storytelling will be enhanced by looking at some of those episodes.
Yeah, yeah, that's the whole point. That's
Hmm.
why they exist.
Hmm. And then you'll be putting it all into the book,
I
or
will,
have put it
and
into the book.
more.
Yes.
Well, it's in
Ah,
progress. Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So I'm putting it into the book, but I'm also adding quite a bit more material. There are writing prompts. I recently got in touch with the National Archives of Ireland because I found a beautiful Finn McCool story that illustrated a point I wanted to make about myth. And I got the permission of the National Archive to include it in the book.
Wow,
Um,
nice.
yeah, that was a lovely exchange. They're just lovely over
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of thing I'm doing. I'm adding more examples. I'm deepening the discussion. I'm adding writing prompts. I'm making it more useful as a desktop reference. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Uh-huh. Yeah. And how did your interest in folklore begin?
Oh, I'm a pagan. Oh my God. Oh, for heaven's sake. Um, I've been pagan since I was 16 years old. I was one of those. I'm part of the generation of pagan women who, and I forget who joked, but she's totally right. It was a pagan woman I knew years ago who came into the craft with a copy of The Spiral Dance in one hand and The Mists of
Yeah.
Avalon in the other.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
so I was part of that of women coming into the craft. And I was Wiccan from the time I was 16 to the time I was 24. And then my interests branched out into Druidry. And when I was 27, I earned a Bachelor of, I started a Bachelor of, I was 28 when I started my Bachelor of Celtic Studies. So I did, a Bachelor of Celtic Studies and learned a great deal about Irish, Scottish, and Welsh literature and history and language. And and I learned, and I remember writing this in a journal, that Gaelic isn't God. So I learned a great deal about the folklore. I learned a great deal about the languages and the history. And yes, it deepened my appreciation of my spirituality. But I think was it Basha who said, "Don't seek after the ancestors, seek what they sought."
Yeah.
Um, so I continued to be interested in folklore. I continued to be interested in language. I continued to be interested in literature, and I allowed them to enchant and inspire my spirituality. But I came to understand that the spiritual compass, always points inward, or at least it should.
Hmm.
And so I went through the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids program, and went through the Bardic Ovate and Druid program, and became a Druid grade O body. And then I also, all throughout my life had had an interest in Northern European cosmology and spirituality, and that blossomed fully, I think, after I finished my time with OBOD. And now I really think of myself as a Nordic animist. So I'm in that space, that period of my life where I take a great deal of inspiration from Northern European cosmology and spirituality and literature. Um, so my love of folklore is, of course, rooted in my spiritual life, but also having become an educated person in folklore, I've learned to both integrate and separate the interests, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you never completely separate those interests apart from each other, whether it be, Scottish Gaelic or the Voluspa. You're never going to completely separate those interests from your spiritual life, but at the same time, um, as a scholar, I can look at them. I can look at folkloristics as a discipline. I can look at language as a part of human knowledge, and then also look at my own spiritual compass and treat that differently. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
And does your study involve travel to these places?
it does. Last year, I gave myself a gift. I'd been working on my doctorate for 8 years. And I wanted to go on retreat, and I had not had the time. I've been a companion at the Chalice Garden in Glastonbury for many years. I went for the first time in 2015, and I've given a little money to the garden every year because it is a sacred place. Um, and I wanted to go back and spend some real time in the garden as a companion of the well. So my husband and I went back to England at Christmas time last year at Yuletide, and we did sort of this part tourist, part pilgrimage
Mhm.
experience, right?
Yeah.
So we went to Winchester Cathedral and went to the Winchester Christmas market and had that experience. But we also went to see the Uffington Horse, and I also
Mhm.
meditated at Wayland Smithy,
And
and
how was that?
that I'm going back next year for the World Fantasy Convention, and I want to spend the night there.
Wow. Okay.
I want
Yeah,
to
I hear
meditate at
that's
Wayland.
quite a rich place to be.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
was there briefly, and I didn't have the time to spend as much time as I wanted
Mhm.
because we had a day, right? And I went and spent some time sitting with the smithy. Uh, but I want to go back and spend the day at the site. Where I did spend more time, I went and spent my time at the Chalice Well, and I went to the White Spring as well and spent a day at the White Spring. And I spent 3 days at the Chalice Well, and I would get up every morning, early in the morning. And companions of the well have the opportunity to visit the gardens when the gardens are closed.
Mm.
And we're invited to meditate in the waters. So I said prayers and made offerings and meditated in the waters um, at the Chalice Well and at the White Spring, both very profound experiences and very different experiences for me. Um, because the Chalice Well is an interfaith space, but if you go into the White Spring, um, it is also an interfaith space, but it's nurtured by pagans. So I felt like I had been invited into a grotto that had been set up for me.
Mm.
And because paganism is a minority spirituality, to be able to walk into a place and greet my own gods and light candles in places and in ways and for reasons that I hold sacred, and to bathe in waters that have been blessed by other pagans. I don't have words for that.
Mhm.
um, I've got words for everything else, but I don't have words for that. And the thing I did last before I went home, I spent a lot of my time at the Chalice Well writing um, writing a ritual, and I went to Stanton Drew on the winter solstice and performed a ritual to bless and reawaken my creative fire.
Oh, mhm.
So yeah, I'm a pilgrim. I
Yeah.
go to places that call to me spiritually as a pagan person, as a heathen, as a Nordic animist. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. So is there any last thing you'd like to say before we close the interview?
Oh my goodness. Because this is because you interview crones,
Yes.
um, I want to say something to my fellow crones.
Ah, good.
And I want to say to my fellow crones that we are not our mothers or our grandmothers or our great grandmothers. We get to be crones in precisely the way that calls to us. And that's going to look different for every woman, and it's going to look different for women of different generations. But what it doesn't look like is an end. We are not at an end. We are barely into the last third of our lives. And so, whatever croning looks like for you, live it richly and let it be the beginning of something amazing.
Well, those are great words to end on. So thank you, Kelly.
Thank you
Um,
for talking to me.
it was a great pleasure. And thank you to the audience for watching and listening.